Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at another Tailwind Flowbite tutorial. This one's going to be for creating a sidebar like this. Now the reason why we're doing this is because there's a bunch of different concepts we can tie in together here. We have the ability to, just navigate the links like we normally do. We have the logout button, works just like you would expect it to. But if we come in here, you can see these categories. We can change one of these from like test to testing just by double clicking. And now if I refresh, this will persist. The on hover tells me exactly how to do that. You can of course remove that or tweak it. You can click on the testing link to go to the testing category. So because this is a double click, when you click on the icon, there is a bit of a delay. Or if you only single click, it won't open that thing. You have to specifically double click. We don't do that on the links because there's a delay between the first click and the second click, which means if you tried to double click edit on the links, you would automatically get redirected on the first click every time, or your users would have to wait like 300 milliseconds after that first click. So there's a couple different things we have to be, cognizant of. Make sure the user experience doesn't suffer too much while you're doing something like this. And the other part of this is, of course, if I log out and sign in as john@doe.com, these categories belong to the users, and each category also has like the actual posts that belong to it as well. So there's a bunch of stuff we have to stitch together here. Let's go ahead and let's get started. I'm gonna go ahead and stop this server, cd out of my demo project, go ahead and run it's gonna be a Rails new video-j of esbuild-c of Tailwind, then we'll cd into that video project. The Flowbite stuff, if you're not familiar, very useful. It has a bunch of free Tailwind components. So if you're using Tailwind like we are, you can just go ahead and follow these steps. They have a bunch of steps. You can skip the installing of Tailwind if you install it the way that we just did. And instead of that, what you're going to do is come down here to the install Flowbite. You're going to use yarn instead of npm. You then just add these plugins, and then there's a turbo section as well so that you can have that turbo support. So to add this, we just have to do a yarn add for Flowbite. We can come over to our project here and come into the Tailwind config. And in the Tailwind config, there's two things it tells us to do here. The first one is going to be to add this plugin section, which we can just do. It's just going to be right below our content. We just paste in plugins. And then in the content itself, it wants us to add this one line. So we just come in here and we add this line. Links to the Flowbite docs will be in the video description. We then have to add the esbuild import right here because we're using esbuild. So we come up here to app, JavaScript, application, and then in the application.js, we just paste this in. So at this point, we are now done with the first step. So let's go ahead and let's add devise. We'll do a bundle add devise to add the devise gem so we can have user accounts. Then we can go ahead and do a Rails G devise Rails G devise. Oh my God, I messed up. Devise install command. There we go. Typing is hard. And then we can do a Rails G devise user command to add those user accounts, just like that. Next, we need to add our scaffolds. Now here we want to be careful. We have to think about the order we want this to happen in. A user will have many categories. So a scaffold can be made for category. And we want this to be a name with a user : references because it belongs to a user. We don't want to generate the post first because the post has to belong to a category. So you always want to go down that line where the thing that belongs to the other thing is generated last. So let's do a Rails G scaffold for our post now with a title, a category : references, a body : text, and a user : references. That'll generate all of that. And now we can do a Rails db : migrate command. And now because of how I run this, I do have to do a gem install foreman. You probably don't have to do this, but now I'll be able to run a bin/dev to start my server. Looks like that's working. I'm gonna go ahead and stop it though, because I want to do a Rails G stimulus for a category controller because we're gonna be using stimulus here. Let's do a bin/dev again, and then come over to localhost port 3000. So that's taking us to our homepage. Let's go over to our routes real quick. Inside of our routes, what we want to do is just set the root of our application. We're going to set it to, actually, let's just do like a homepage real quick. We'll say pages controller home action, which means we do have to stop the server again, run a Rails G controller pages home, and then we can do a bin/dev one final time, hopefully. So that gives us a homepage to redirect to. Now let's come up here to our app, our views, our layouts, and our application.html.erb. So over here in the Tailwind Flowbite docs, you can find a example sidebar. So you have the sidebar right here with a bunch of stuff in it. And then if you scroll below it, they always have the code. You can click the copy button. Just go ahead and copy that. So now that we have that, we want to create a partial, but because of how we're going to structure this, we're actually going to have quite a few partials to deal with. So we're just going to create a new folder in our views, call this the sidebar. And then for the actual body here in this yield tag, we are going to have quite a bit of extra code. So let's come into our sidebar, right click, new file. I'm going to call this underscore index.html.erb because this is kind of like the sidebar index. And then for this actual sidebar here, we're going to have to sort of extract out a little bit of stuff. Now I've gone ahead and I've already figured out how to like reformat this because there's a bunch of stuff. The aside here is our actual sidebar. This bit right here is what's going to get removed and reformatted a bit. So we have these divs. Let's scroll up a bit until we get up to the top here. Get rid of all of these because we don't need these. Then we're going to refactor this a little bit so we only have the P4 right here. The rest of the stuff is just going to look a little weird. It's going to keep those gray boxes that you see right here. So we don't want those. So we actually just want this div and we want to move this into our application layout. So we're going to come into our app layout. We're going to paste in this div and then we're going to wrap the yield tag with that div. Then we're going to do a .container-fluid, hit tab, hit enter, and we're going to wrap all of this in a container fluid. Then inside of this container fluid, but outside of that P4, we want to do a render for a sidebar / index, just like that. Now we can come over here to our local host and you can see we have all of our icons already working. That can be a good thing. It can also be a bad thing because it means we're going to have to refactor out all of those icons, which can be kind of a pain. So for actually doing the sidebar, I figured the least painful way to cover this is for me to just go through it and sort of copy paste what I have. Now, thankfully, I've managed to refactor pretty much all of it. So we keep this button up here. We're going to go ahead and collapse this button. We keep the sidebar or the aside. We have this div, that's fine. And then we have this UL. For each of these LIs, we actually extract these into a separate thing. So we're going to have in our sidebar a new partial called _link.html.erb. And then we also in our sidebar need to create a _category.html.erb. We'll worry about this in a second. And the final thing we need is a _logout.html.erb because the logout button specifically needs extra stuff to work for Devise. So now that we've done that in here, we have this first LI. This is for our dashboard. What we want to do is we want to take this and extract it and put it into our link. And then in our link itself, what we want to do is we want to extract this a bit. So the first thing we can do is we can just add in our path right here for this href. Then instead of having this entire SVG here, we want to replace this with just a icon. And then finally for our span here, we just want this to be a quick little span for whatever text we pass in. So now we have to pass in a path, a icon, and a class. For all of these, you're going to want to make sure that you have this SVG here. And then whatever you want to do, you want to come into your sidebar, do a new folder, call this icons. And then whatever you want to call these icons. So in this case, we'll say this is for the home button. We'll just say _home.html.erb. And then you're going to paste in this SVG. And this can be kind of a pain, but it allows you to at least make this somewhat reusable because these SVGs are just awful to work with. But what this allows us to now do is come into our sidebar and let's say for the home action, we can get rid of this entire LI and we can replace this with a quick little render. It renders a sidebar /link. The path is the root path. The icon is a render for the icon /home. And the text is the home button or the home text. So we can refresh and now we have this home button here that takes us to the home page. So that's pretty cool. Now, similarly, if you like any of these icons, go ahead and put these into a separate partial. In my case, I kind of don't want these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to backspace out of here. Now I have copied some of them into separate partials. I'm going to go ahead and create those real quick. Okay, so I've created a partial for the categories, the home button, the new category, the sign in button, and the sign up button. If you want any of these, you'll also be able to get them by going over to the Flowbite /icons link. And in here, you can search for whatever you want. In the case of the categories, I searched for the word folder, came in here, clicked copy, and then you can come over here and you can just paste this in and it'll give you the entire SVG just by doing that. So again, this link will be in the video description. Don't have to worry about it. You can also go to the GitHub repo in the video description if you just want to copy this project structure that I have here. But this gives us all of these icons. And what this now allows us to do is come into our sidebar and say, do a quick little check. So let's come into the index.html right here. We'll do a if user signed in. If the user signed in, we can render another sidebar link for a new category path, render a path to sidebar/icon/new category with a text of new category. We can also, right here, go ahead and render a partial for our categories. So we say current user.categories.each do category, where we render a sidebar/category, which is what that partial right here is. We pass in the category. Now this we do still need to set up. And the way we set this up is we come into our models, and in our user model, we need to make sure that our user has many of each of these. So we say a user has many posts and it has many categories. Then in our category, we need to make sure that the category has many posts. We can come into our post real quick, and this should already be set up for both. Now for the controllers, we can come into our post controller. You can say before action, and then we can make sure this is an authenticate user for index and or for everything except for index and show. And then for the create, we just do a quick little merge for the user ID. So this allows us to just merge the user ID in so we don't have to set it. This is for our create here. So we come down here, we make sure we have all 4 of these being permitted. We're good. Next, let's come into the categories controller. In the categories controller, we can scroll down. We're permitting the name and the user ID. So let's come up here to our create action once again, and let's just go ahead and let's merge this. That takes care of that, but we do need to come down here to the update and make sure we change how this format.json works. Right now it renders the show page. We don't want that. We want it to render some JSON. Let me go ahead and actually comment this out so you can see what changes. We want this to render some JSON that says status okay with a name of category. This is because of how we're going to be handling the actual updating. That's the only change we need to make in the categories controller though. So at this point, we're done with both of the controllers, and we can come back to the index page and take a look at what we have. If we come to our page and we refresh, we will start running into some errors here because some of these things aren't done yet. So now we have to do an end for this if user signed in to get rid of that error. We now only have a home link, of course. So now that we have this, what happens if we're not signed in? Well, let's do a else block. And then in this else block, what we want to do is we want to say, all right, if we're not signed in, let's first handle the logout button. That's probably a better idea. Let's start with this render logout. So this is a sidebar/logout link. This is different from the regular link, but what you can actually do here is probably clean up what I have a bit more. It is the same LI as in the link. The only difference is the icon, of course, and the href right here, this a tag, also has a data-turbo-method equals delete. This is what lets it work for turbo. And then for this icon, if you want to, you can, of course, extract this out into a icons, call this _logout.html.erb, paste this in here, and then we can come back over here and we can just do a render. It's going to be sidebar/icon/logout, something like that. Come over here and refresh. And then come back into our index. And this should be working now, I guess. We're not actually signed in. I'm being silly. So now let's do the sign in stuff. For the sign in stuff, it's going to be more shared links. So we can just paste these in. First one's a link to the sidebar link or with the new user session path. This is just a regular sign in link. And then we also have the sign up link. Again, reusing this link partial as much as possible, so we only have to change it in one place. This now allows us to sign in and sign up. So let's go ahead and sign up with dean@example.com and a password of password, just like that. Now I can click on new category. I'll name the first one general, except I can see here the form is messed up. So let's come into the categories and the form. And in the categories form, let's get rid of this user ID because we don't need it. And then let's also come back into the categories controller because I think we forgot the before action in here as well to authenticate the user. Again, we want these to work for the show and index, but everything else we want to make sure that people are logged in. If we refresh now, we can actually create a general category. We can then create one more, call this testing, click create category and go back. If we now go back to the home page, we can see we still don't have any categories appearing here. So let's come back into our index page, which is somewhere in my application here. So for the index page, we have the render for the category partial. But if we come into the category partial, it's going to be empty. So what does the category partial look like? Well, this is where things start getting a little bit more involved. So we're going to use the same idea that we had previously, which is we have those links, right? So we're going to go ahead and we're going to copy some of this stuff. We once again have a span here. I'm going to go ahead and just close this span for now. Close it like this. After the, or inside of the span, we want to render a partial for a category icon. Then after the category icon, we want to render a quick little, or create a quick little div. This div is going to have a name and an ML and a data-category-target of name. So what is this coming from? Well, we have this category stimulus controller. For the category stimulus controller, though, we have to set up quite a few things. And where we want to attach this controller is always important. So in this case, where I'm going to make this controller attach is just going to be in this span right here. So it's going to look like this, if I can clean this up a bit. What we do is we tell it has to bind to the stimulus category controller right here. We pass in the category ID. We pass in a data-action, which says if you click on this, call the category controller click action in our stimulus controller. And then we have a data-tooltip-target set to the DOM ID for the category tooltip. Because our tooltips require a unique ID, we use this DOM ID for the category because this is going to give us something like category_14_tooltip, with 14 being the ID of the thing, right? So every time we need to use this, we can just have this create a unique ID for us. And then down here, we can create the actual div with an ID of DOM ID. This is where we can set the text if we want to. And this is coming from the Flowbite default tooltips components. You can come in here, you can hover over this, you can see the tooltip content. I just came in here, copied this, pasted it in here, and then I reconfigured it with a lot of the stimulus stuff. Okay, so that takes care of that. I think I've covered pretty much everything here. Again, with stimulus, we've covered it plenty of times on the channel. You need to set up these bindings for the category target, and you set it as a name so you can then, modify this. To actually do this, though, we have to come into our JavaScript and our categories controller. And this is where we start to have to do quite a bit of stuff. So the first thing we have to do is set up that static list of targets where we have our name. We can then modify our connect method to just have a couple things in it. I'm also going to include a console.log that just says connected because I like making sure that my stimulus controller is at least connecting. I'm going to come in here, hit Control-Shift-I, refresh the page. First thing you'll notice is now our categories are displaying here and we can visit them. But when we try to do anything else, we run into this error because our on-click action here doesn't exist yet. We only have a connect. So we have to still create this click action. But this at least means our controller is connected. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to full screen this and move this up a bit so we can actually get to work here. For the click event, it's going to look a little bit something like this. The logic being you start with a click count of 0, you increment it by 1. It's now equal to 1, obviously, which means you set a timeout. The timeout sets the click count to 0. And the reason why you do this is you want to do a quick little check. If they hit it fast enough within this timeout, then you want them to have the double click happen, which will cause that editor to happen. It'll then clear the timeout, set the click count back to 0, and call a handle double click. So a lot of stuff to digest here. First is the single click timeout. This is just a constant we declare up top, which is just set to like 300. So this is just a timeout with a duration of 300 effectively. Then for the clear timeout, that is just by JavaScript itself. That's nothing we really have to do. So let's go ahead and let's handle the double click. Double click looks like this. Console.log says it was clicked. Event.prevent default stops it from going to the link for whatever reason. We then have the original name target, which we get from this .name target, which is what we get from the category here. So it gets the original name of the category. And the reason why we do that is because we need to use this original name target for some magic later, because we're going to be replacing the original name target with, so the div with an ID, or the div with the class right here, we're going to be replacing this with an input. When we finish with the input, we have to go back to this. So that's why we need to store the original name target. We then get the category name from the query selector inner text. We set the input field, we create the input field, we pass in the category name. Which obviously means if we're creating a new input, we need to put the old value like the general into that new input. And that's where we come down here and we do a create input field. Now this looks scary, but a lot of this is actually just pretty boring CSS because I was too lazy to give it a class. Basically what we do is we create a new input. We set the type to text, the value to be the value we just passed in, which is the previous text. So like general, for example. Then we set the style to 100%, the box sizing to border box, the style to inherit, or the height to inherit, the line height to inherit. We add an event listener for blur, which is usually when you click off of something or like lose focus. We add a key up listener. So this is if you hit enter, and these will cause it to call the blur event listener, which will call a submit event. So what does the submit event look like? Well, this is going to be by far the scariest thing, but if you've seen this with JavaScript before, it's really not that bad. So what is the input field? Well, the input field is just the input field we just created, which is the event.target, which is what we're calling this on. Then we have the category ID, which we get from our data set because we double clicked on it. We have this category ID right here in our data, so we can access that. And then we have the category name, which is coming from that input field.value. We then call a fetch. The fetch here is pretty standard stuff, goes to category / the category ID with a method of patch. The headers are pretty standard. The only thing you need to do here is a except for application /JSON, because I was getting a weird redirect issue until I added this, because in our controller, our categories controller, when you do the update action, it was still considering a formatted HTML request instead of JSON. So I had to tell it specifically to accept the application /JSON. We then get the XCSRF token, which is of course Rails' way of making sure the form is legit. And to get this, we have to come down here and create one last method to get a meta value, which is just going to get a element from the document head with the query selector of meta name. If you're not familiar with that, if you come into your elements inspector, come in here to the head and scroll down, you should hopefully see a CSRF token right here. This meta tag with a CSRF token is what we want to grab, so we can say this is in fact a real form, and then we return the element. Okay, so that's that. That gets us our first bit here for the headers. Then for the body, we just stringify the category and the name of category name. Credentials are same origin because of course it's coming from the same origin. Then we say if the status is equal to OK, which we are returning, we can then set this.originalNameTarget.querySelector.inner text to be equal to name, which is what we get back, which is the new name. So now we're updating the new name, and then we can replace the original name target and the input field. Optionally, you can handle some errors. You can also handle errors here for fetches specifically, but at this point you are pretty much done with this little bit. So now if we come over here and we refresh and we double click, we should be able to change this to test, hit enter, and we don't see any errors in our console. If we come in here to our terminal, we see a yellow bit of text, which means that did actually get updated. Let's go ahead and let's refresh, and it still says test. I'll go ahead and change this back to general. So that's working. The last thing that you would really want to do here is maybe come in and say, all right, I want to, sprucing up the categories partial. I think I changed that one a little bit. So let's come up here. Let's come into the, let's actually go to the /posts route. So let's go to /posts. And if we click new post, we want to change this form a bit. Let's come into our posts and our post form. In our post form, we want to get rid of this user ID bit. And for the category here, I actually want this to be a select. So I'll just type SEL and wait for GitHub Copilot, which will map all of the categories with their name and their IDs. Now we can come over here and refresh. We can say test and case for the post name, and then we can change the category to whatever we want. I'll just go with general, click create post. Post was created, cool. If I now come over to the general category, I want to change this partial as well. So let's come back to the categories and the actual category partial here. Now the category partial here is kind of cringe. What we're going to do instead is we're just going to set the name into an H1. It's a bit styled. We then iterate through each of the categories posts, put the title and the author, and then we just put the content there as well. So now we can come over here and refresh. We can see the general category has these posts in it. Come back to the home page. You can click here. This all works. And then if we, let's say we're on the testing and we double click on the folder, you can see it doesn't redirect us to general yet. But afterwards, we can, of course, click on this and go to general. So that is it. I know this was a longer one, but there's quite a bit of stuff to cover here. Of course, I kind of hand-waved a lot of the JavaScript, but at this point, I've covered this so many times, I'm starting to lose track of what I need to actually talk about. So hopefully this was at least interesting. I always like doing stuff like this because it just feels a little bit more polished when you can just do these inline edits. And yeah, the Flowbite stuff is always a really neat bonus too whenever I get to talk about that. But that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Links, as always, will be in the video description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.